Welcome, everyone. I want to welcome you all to our forum this afternoon, Prove It First. We are the DFL Environmental Caucus, and we will be joined today by our moderator, Megan Bond, Senator John Marty of SD 66, Senator Jenn McEwen of SD 7, and Nancy Schuldt, Fond du Lac Water Coordinator. I also would like to acknowledge our outreach officer, Molly McGregor, our communications officer, Kristen Larson, and our legislative director, Greg Layden, who were instrumental in making today happen. Thank you very much for joining us. We have a resolution that the DFL Environmental Caucus has supported for many years, asking for a moratorium on copper nickel sulfide mining. And we are pleased that this resolution is now a DFL resolution. It is part of the action agenda. And for all the reasons that will be laid out here very clearly today. Our mission as a caucus is to educate and mobilize the citizens of Minnesota to address our climate crisis and to protect and preserve and restore our natural environment. We also are dedicated to fighting racial injustice and environmental justice. We want to make sure that we are honoring our treaties that we have formed, that those belong to all of us, not just those who choose to pay attention, that we consider every position and every step we take as a caucus as a means to help connect with and work with our underrepresented communities. We also, in our climate action, strongly support the DFL resolution that declares a climate emergency. And we understand that we must do everything to diversify our economy, move to renewable energy, and look at what's happening today. We have particulate matter that has settled out over our state, making unclean air. We understand the co-benefits of switching to renewables. We also understand that 25% of our emissions come from transportation, and therefore we are also looking forward to co-hosting this forum coming up on writing clean car rules with none other than Bill McEwen, MN 350, and several other co-sponsors. We hope you'll join us for that forum on March 4th. If you love nature and you care about these issues that we're discussing today, I sure hope you've joined the caucus. But if you haven't, there's still time. We are up to about 1,100 members from all over the state. I urge you to go to our website, dflenvironment.org, and join us. And now I would like to introduce our moderator, Ms. Megan Bond. She is a member of our DFL Executive Committee. She's a lawyer from up in International Falls, Minnesota, who's been doing environmental advocacy work since she was 16. Megan is passionate about all things water and natural spaces and parks. And she is an active member of our board, taking on many leadership positions. So welcome, and I turn it over to Megan.
Thanks, Vita. Good afternoon, everyone. Like Vita said, I'm an International Falls resident and board member, as well as a board member for Voyagers Conservancy. So national parks and public lands, like she said, have always been a big passion of mine. So as an International Falls resident, I live in the Rainy River watershed, which is one of the two major watersheds that are at risk with these projects right now. So this is literally in my backyard. And once again, we want to protect this just because forests sequester carbon. They act as a natural infrastructure barrier for catastrophic climate events that we've been having. And but what's really great about what's going on with this Prove It First is it doesn't discriminate amongst watersheds. It wants to protect every watershed in Minnesota, not just the two that are at risk right now, but everyone. So right now there's two major bills, HF 148 and Senate File 59, that are introduced in the House and the Senate. We have a couple of those authors, as well as some clone bills I recently learned that have popped up for this. And so I'll begin by introducing our first speaker, Senator John Marty. Senator John Marty is our senator from SD 66, and he is a well-known progressive champion for environmental issues, racial and environmental justice, and healthcare. So I'll let him get started. Senator Marty.
Thank you, Megan. And I should ask, because I'm filling in for Representative Alice Hausman, who had wished to be here, but had a conflict come up that she couldn't avoid at the last minute. So she asked if I'd be willing to fill in, so I'm happy to. But I didn't hear how, in terms of the format, how long should I be talking now? I know we're going to have mainly discussion, I think, but.
Well, yes, in terms of format, we've got 3 speakers. We've got you, Senator Jenn McEwen, and Nancy Schuldt, as Vita mentioned earlier. And we're going to ask each speaker to have about 20 minutes. And in addition to that, we will have time for Q&A at the end. And as Kristen mentioned at the beginning, if you have any questions, if you could just put them in the chat and direct them directly to the direct questions here, people. So there we go. So yes, take it away.
Good. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be with you. And the Environmental Caucus is much needed, has been much needed in the DFL for a long time. And for the last number of years that you've been in existence and growing in numbers, I might add. It's been wonderful to have you. And we in the legislature have often felt overwhelmed by people who are not so interested in the environment. It's been positive changes lately, while we are still not a majority in terms of Senate DFL. We nevertheless have a lot more people who care deeply about the environment. And I'll say the best illustration of that is District 7 and Senator McEwen, who I am thrilled to have in, not only because she's authoring this bill, but because she cares deeply about the environment. And a few years ago, I think you could count on one hand the number of DFL Senate members who were really environmental advocates. And I mean, not just, well, we'll vote with you most of the time, but who really would fight for it. Now I think it really has increased significantly. And Jenn is a perfect illustration of what's changing. And so I'm excited to be in part of a Senate that, with the Senate DFL caucus, we don't spend half our time talking about how, well, we can't really be for the environment because we have to balance this against that. And so things are changing that way. When we look at the Prove It First legislation, it's kind of illustration that tries to put the words of the mining industry up against them. They keep saying, oh, we're going to do it right. We can do it right. We can do it safely. We can do it cleanly. And as Prove It First is trying to point out, they haven't done it cleanly and safely, and there's not much evidence they can. But the one deep frustration that shows the need for this legislation is that a lot of Minnesotans, including a lot of the news media, including a lot of DFLers, think that, well, you know, we ought to do mining here because we've got so much tougher standards than anybody else in the world. You know, we don't want it to be done in a third world country where they don't have any concern for labor rights, any concern for environment, any concern for anything else, because we've got such tough standards. We've been hearing people say that. I've been in the legislature for over 30 years. I've been hearing it said for a lot longer than 30 years. And it's just given as a fact. Of course, we've got stronger laws. But then you look at like the Polymet mine proposal, and you could look at the financial assurance package, which is supposed to protect taxpayers, which I think is a sham of a financial assurance package. You look at the safety, the dam safety standards, everything like that. And you find that we are so far off of reality when we say we've got the strongest standards, because I think about a week ago, we had the second anniversary of a catastrophic mine dam collapse in Brazil. Brazil, one of those countries without strong environmental standards. It killed 250 miners, huge catastrophe, destroyed huge swaths of beautiful environment and killing people. That was the second time one of these upstream tailings dams, the tailings being the waste rock, upstream tailings dams collapsed in Brazil. One a couple years earlier than that killed, I think, 15, 20 people. And Brazil has now gotten to the point that they decide that kind of upstream tailings dam. Upstream not meaning that it's upstream, but upstream meaning as the water in the dam, behind the dam fills up, they put the new dam, they keep packing the waste rock to make the new dam wall. They put it partly over the existing fill, the existing watery sludge. And then when it fills up to the new level, then they put a new thing over it. It's a design feature that has been used because it's less expensive than other kinds. Anyhow, Brazil decided after 250 plus people died that this was not a good idea. Brazil is banned the use of this type of tailings dam. And not only that, but they're actually requiring replacement of the ones that are that way, which I'm sure is going to take a long time and huge expense, but they have to do that. This type of dam failure has happened in many other places as well. And Polymet, the state of Minnesota, with our stiff environmental laws, has permitted them to build a dam with this upstream tailings dam design. And if Brazil, one of those countries with lousy environmental standards, won't allow them and is requiring removal of the existing ones, why are we putting in a new one now? And that's one small illustration. And to say that, well, maybe we do it better, or we're going to enforce it better, or we're going to manage it better, or we're going to do something else better. Well, these dams aren't something that have to last 30 years. I mean, when we've been fighting pipelines and so on, well, it only lasts 50 years or 30 years, which is the problem with pipelines we're putting in now. But with these dams, they have to last for 10,000 years, maybe a lot longer than that. And so we got to have something that's stable that way. Well, the DNR had a mining engineer from Montana. He was one of, I'm sure, many that they hired as consultants on the Polymet project. And he, the DNR, he said all kinds of things. You can tell the guy is very quotable. His name is Don Sutton. He's a well-respected mining engineer. He's about to basically retiring now. And when you look at what he's got, what he says, it's pretty maybe inflammatory. When the consultant wrote that he was surprised that Minnesota law would permit this type of tailings dam for permanent storage, and said, quote, "This wouldn't be allowed in other states." He said the risk of long-term failure of the dam is an almost certainty. And you got to keep in mind, this is a guy who is not an environmental groups, MCEA or water protectors or anybody. They're not the ones who hired this guy. This was the DNR who hired him, the people who gave the permit. And the DNR's explanation of why I wanted to talk to the guy, make sure I wasn't misquoting him or anything. And they first wanted me to meet with the DNR staff, and I did that a couple of times. And then they said, well, we think he's going to be out of context. You'll take him out of context. That's why I wanted to meet with him. They said that he wasn't actually hired for dam safety. The reason they hired him was for their financial assurance, to make sure they have enough money set aside. And obviously you read the guy's qualifications and you see he does know how to deal with dam safety. And it's probably partly because of the risk of the dam collapsing that he wants more financial assurance money in there. And so that's the way we look at it. This guy, when I like to read his quotes, I compare them to the ones that, like Polymet, the CEO of Polymet, John Cherry, said, Polymet has demonstrated that we can and will meet or exceed regulatory standards and industry best practices. And I say industry best practices because these upstream tailing dams, I believe they've been banned in Canada, where Polymet is based, I believe. They say they're going to do it the right way. And Don Sutton, one of his memos, he said he described the dam as a, quote, Hail Mary type of concept that will exacerbate, quote, exacerbate erosion and slope failure and will eventually fail. Again, that's a DNR consultant. He said that he calls the risk of the long-term failure of the dam is an almost certainty. And at some point, the entire mass will unravel. Another point, he said, Polymet's dam, quote, gives me severe indigestion because a lake on top of a pile of sand is inherently unstable and irresponsible. And that's why when the DNR's own consultant says that, and the DNR permits this type of dam that wouldn't be allowed elsewhere, you get the sense that maybe our standards aren't the strongest in the world. And so we shouldn't be relying on our, in theory, the knowledge we have deep in our minds that we're really better than everybody else to take care of us. We got to recognize that our laws are not going to protect it. And that's why Senator McEwen's prove it first legislation is the kind of thing we need to do. You guys say you can do it, prove it first. Give us evidence it can happen. That's what we need to show. So I'm happy to, I don't think I need to take my full 10, I think I've taken about 10 minutes, but I think I'd rather devote the rest of it to question and answer stuff. And so with that, I'll turn it over to, back to the host.
Thank you so much, Senator Marty. It was wonderful. Our next speaker is our senator from here in northern Minnesota in Duluth, Jenn McEwen. She's also a board member of the DFL Environmental Caucus and came in with the primary and got about, what, 75% of the delegates to get the endorsement, 70% of the votes in the primary, and won her general election with just that much, and picked up endorsements from pretty much every progressive group you can think of. So we're very excited to have her in the Senate as one of the main main legislators that proposed this Prove It First. So Jenn is a lawyer in Duluth representing disabled workers, and she serves as president of the Damiano Center as well, which serves families struggling with food security. So I won't take up too much of your time because I know Jenn has so much to tell us. Senator McEwen, excuse me. I will get used to saying that because I know she has so much to tell us about all the work she does. She's also involved with Duluth for Clean Water. So yeah, Senator McEwen.
Thank you very much, Megan. You can definitely still call me Jenn. You don't have to call me Senator McEwen. but I am very delighted to be the state senator representing Duluth in the Minnesota State. It has really been a thrilling couple of months with the start of the session. I'm learning a lot, and I'm just so honored to hold this position and to represent my community. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining us today to talk about the Prove It First legislation that we've introduced into the Minnesota State Senate and House. We do have many authors, and just a technical issue is that in the Senate, we still have this sort of antiquated practice of only allowing 5 senators to technically be an author of a bill. So if you look at the Prove It First legislation, the chief bill, of which I'm the lead author in the Senate, you'll only see 5 authors, but there are a number of what we call clones. And that is where a senator also wants to be a co-author. And so they just introduced the same legislation with a different number. And I think we're up to 4 clones. So there's a lot of authors in the Senate, and then also a number of co-authors in the House. So we're really moving along. We have some really good momentum behind this legislation and behind these efforts. And really that the momentum that we have and the support that we have statewide is really due to, in large part, the grassroots organizing on the ground, talking to neighbors, communities about this type of mining by groups like the DFL Environmental Caucus, Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness, Water Legacy, Duluth for Clean Water, a number of citizens organizations where people in our communities, wanted answers about this kind of mining and were alarmed at sort of being rebuffed and put off and ignored by people in power, and told to just sort of quiet and don't ask questions, don't worry about it, we got this. And many of us in Duluth and throughout the state, but in Duluth, especially because we're downstream from where the proposed polymet project would be built, we're very alarmed. We live at the zenith of the Great Lakes, on Lake Superior, majestic Lake Superior, and the St. Louis River flows right into Lake Superior through the Duluth Harbor. And we have a lot of pride in Duluth around living on Lake Superior. That lake is a part of who we are. It's part and parcel of our identity. It's the foundation for our economy. It's why we live where we do. It's why that city is there. And we see it every day. Duluth is on a hill. Many of you know, you can just kind of turn your head most places where you are in Duluth and look out on this majestic lake. So the idea that we would mess around with this type of new, dangerous, never been done safely for a watershed type of mining in this water-rich environment at the headwaters of the St. Louis River, and then have that acid mine drainage and mining waste flow down the St. Louis River waterway into Lake Superior is just untenable for Duluthians, I think, quite frankly. And so, so yes, being rebuffed and kind of told by people in power for a number of years, no, we're just following the process and we're studying this, we'll go along. And we were raising questions and raising alarm about what we're hearing from scientists about this type of mining and the effect it would have on our economy and our way of life, and our natural environment, our water. And being rebuffed, I think that there was just eventually this momentum to say enough is enough. We really need some clear answers on this, and we're going to need to have a sort of precautionary principle enshrined in law around this type of mining. If the claims are correct, if this mining can be done safely, then prove it first. Show us an example where this type of mining has been done safely, where the mine has been opened for 10 years operating and then has closed for 10 years without pollution, to watersheds, and then we'll talk. Then we'll talk about whether or not this could be a good possibility for development in northern Minnesota. You know, and as we know, in northern Minnesota as a whole, you know, you get up into the northern part of our state and it's water. It's mostly water. It's water and wetlands, lakes, rivers, watersheds, just sort of marbled with land, but it's mostly water. And so, you know, as we move into this age of the climate crisis and, you know, the mitigations that we're trying to make, we know that fresh water and clean water is going to be a crucial part of how we are able to move forward sustainably with a community where we can all thrive. And the idea that we would put that resource and that clean water gem that we live amongst in any danger, particularly at this time in history, is just, it's something that we shouldn't even really be considering. I mean, these projects really should never have seen the light of day. And I think that what that points to is that these projects are being driven by a profit motive. That they wouldn't be happening, for example, you know, if Duluth and if northeastern Minnesota, if we all got together and we have an economic forum and we say, you know, what kind of economic development would be good for us to do together in community, we wouldn't come up with this idea, because it's madness. It's madness. It's too much risk to our economy. And the only reason that this type of experimental mining is being pushed is because a few very wealthy people stand to make a lot of money on our backs and on the backs of our environment and on the backs of workers as well. Now we can talk about that more as we continue on with question and answer, because that's, you know, a whole piece of what this is about is exploiting labor in northeastern Minnesota as well. So, so yeah, I am really honored to be the lead author in the Senate on this legislation. I think it is just so vital to sort of set that baseline of where we're going to go from here. But then the next step, of course, is moving forward with sustainable economic development, clean energy-based economic development that is going to provide not just a living wage to people, but a family supporting, thriving wage for people to live in community with one another in northern Minnesota. And So I look forward to talking a lot more about that piece, because I think that that really is the juggernaut that we're dealing with in northern Minnesota. Yeah, thanks for having this forum today, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Senator McEwen. It was so great to have you speak to us here. I'm really glad that we're going to leave a little extra time for Q&A, because we got a lot of questions coming in both beforehand and now. So our next speaker is Nancy Schuldt. Nancy is Water Projects Coordinator for the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, and she leads the band's environmental review, mining, and energy impacts to trust resources. So Nancy?
Thank you, Megan. And thank you, Kristen, for reaching out and inviting me to be a part of this forum. I see some familiar faces. I've had opportunities to talk about Fond du Lac's experience and engagement in review of mining in Minnesota, and what we are seeing and what our concerns are and how they are, or in most cases, are not being addressed. I've been working for the band since 1997. I was hired to help Fond du Lac establish a water quality standards program. And there are only about 50 tribes nationwide that have federally approved water quality standards. It's really the backbone and the basis for our efforts to protect the water resources of the reservation. And even though our delegated authorities under the Clean Water Act by EPA only extend to waters of the reservation, the St. Louis River is our connection, literally our connection to the mining that is already taking place and much of the mining that is proposed to take place. And finally, the 1854 ceded territory is the Ojibwe people's backyard in northeastern Minnesota. And the treaty rights that were retained back in 1854 in the Treaty of La Pointe represented some really forward-thinking leadership from the tribes at that time. They recognized that in order to preserve traditional lifeways and values, that they would need to have access to healthy and sustainable resources for future generations. And that's what those treaties are intended to uphold. And they have been litigated all the way to the Supreme Court and upheld. And so when we engage with state agencies and with federal agencies in the review of mining projects and the review of permits for mining projects, it is not only with our own standing to protect the waters of the reservation, but also our standing and expectation and the trust responsibility of the federal government to ensure that those resources remain healthy and sustainable. I'm really thrilled that this legislation is coming forward. When I've heard about Prove It First as a concept before this year, before there's actually bills in front of the legislature to be debated and considered, a lot of the defensiveness coming from the mining industry will point to the Flambeau mine in Ladysmith, Wisconsin. And frankly, that's the only one that they ever point to. And if you have taken the time to look into what actually happened in that relatively tiny mine that only operated for about 8 years and has since been closed and is seriously and significantly polluting adjacent surface water and groundwater, the only reason that they continue to point to that as an example is for the very reason that gives me pause about mining in Minnesota. And that's the fact that the regulatory environment has been hijacked by the industry. And the fact that the existing laws that we have under the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the the Minnesota regulations and statutes that are associated with the DNR's permit to mine and dam safety. What I have seen in my examination of mining projects for going, on for more than 15 years now is that rules mean nothing when they are not enforced. And they mean less than nothing when they stand as a shield for the industry by papering over what is really happening to the environment. What I have often talked to groups about when I'm asked to talk about our experience in the review of mining projects is that we don't even need to speculate about how well the state of Minnesota will be able to regulate a copper nickel mine like Polymet or Twin Metals, or the ones that are being proposed out near Tamarack, or further up along the Duluth complex in northeastern Minnesota. We have ample evidence going back decades about how poorly the state of Minnesota has regulated the existing mining industry. And I know that this legislation that is the heart of today's discussion has to do specifically with copper nickel mining. But I can tell you that the state of Minnesota does not know how to regulate existing hard rock ferrous mining and protect the environment. What we have seen from the very beginning of our engagement, when I say we, I mean tribal staff who have worked closely together on environmental review and permit review, is that our assumption that the wild rice water quality standards were being enforced was a pipe dream. And when we began to shine a light on the fact that existing water quality standards intended to protect the state grain, never mind maybe the most important, significant cultural sustenance resource in northeastern Minnesota, Mahnomen, to realize that that assumption was completely flawed was earth-shattering. And frankly, the more we shone a light on the fact that it was not being enforced or implemented, the more we asked EPA in their oversight authority to remind MPCA that this is a valid water quality standard, that it should be enforced in permits, it should be enforced in assessment, it should be carried through to impaired waters list, etc. The more we have seen the political pushback. Tommy Rukavina tried to promulgate a new sulfate standard on the floor of the Capitol building, just picked a number out of thin air, and was reminded by the EPA that that's not how the Clean Water Act works. But that's just a really good example of how existing operating hard rock mines in the state of Minnesota are not meeting our water quality standards and are not being made to meet our water quality standards. The existing taconite facilities are themselves the largest source of mercury in the Lake Superior Basin. And I have been working on two things since my very first days working for the band: wild rice and mercury, because we have a real problem with mercury in fish, particularly in this part of the state, whereby the mercury that is emitted into the atmosphere falls upon our watersheds, is bioaccumulated in the fish and the wildlife and the people who eat fish to a greater extent than elsewhere in the state. And so our existing hard rock mines are not meeting standards that will protect wild rice, and are at this point refusing, digging their heels in about reducing their mercury emissions so that their contribution to the problem in Minnesota and the problem in the Lake Superior Basin, they take responsibility for. So against the backdrop of knowing that our regulatory framework in the state of Minnesota is not sufficient to protect this water-rich environment of northeastern Minnesota, of the 1854 ceded territory, of the Fond du Lac Reservation. There's no way that a more toxic form of hard rock mining, that is mining a sulfide ore body, that will in and of itself create additional, much more reactive, much more toxic mine waste. There is no way that any of us can take confidence that our existing regulatory framework is sufficient to protect our shared resources. And I'm also going to try to conclude here really quickly because I think the questions and answers are maybe the biggest and most important reason for this gathering today. But I just wanted to point out that our engagement, Fond du Lac and the other tribes who have been cooperating agencies on the PolyMed EIS, who have consistently pushed back against permit reissuance and poorly written permits, we have constantly been painted as being anti-mining. Now, while I personally do not believe that we need to be mining in this region, the tribes have never presented their position as being anti-mining. They have always presented their position somewhat along the lines of prove it first. We expect that if mining is going to happen in Minnesota, that the regulations will be enforced and that the industry will abide by them. And we were willing to live with that construct. But instead, we have been deliberately polarized and marginalized. And we have continued to bring science and knowledge and the rule of law to our arguments. And as a very last resort, when none of that is considered, we have turned to the courts. And we've only done that a few times. But every time we have, we've been successful. In fact, it hasn't been widely disseminated, but there was a court ruling just this week on our challenge to the 401 certification. We sued EPA because they neglected to take our water quality standards authority into account when PCA issued a 401 certification for the Army Corps' 404 wetlands permit. They EPA completely blew off the band, knowing full well that they had an obligation under the Clean Water Act to listen to our concerns, to have a public hearing, to enable us to elevate our concerns and either deny that permit or attach more stringent conditions to it. And EPA blew us off. The court sided with us. And so that's just an example of how far we are willing to go. We bring science, we bring knowledge, we bring the rule of law to our arguments and to our battles. And we're willing to continue to push as long and as hard as it takes. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was wonderful. It's very informative. We have a lot of questions that are going to be related to what you said too that came up during this time with although, like you said, a lot of the science and rule of law coming together here. So I'm going to start off just with some of the questions that came in prior to this and then ones that have rolled in, and some of which are going to be directed towards some of our panelists, and some of them are directed towards all of you, but please do not think that just because I say Senator Marty or Nancy or Senator McEwen that the rest of you can't chime in, because I know you guys are all very highly expertise in this area and very passionate about these projects. So I'm going to start off with one that's kind of political, submitted by one of our former board members. And I'll kind of direct this one towards Senator McEwen, because this is something I know she and I have spoken about in the past and is a pretty divisive issue up here in our area. But once again, any of the speakers, please chime in. So much of the L in our DFL seems to blindly support mining and have been blind to its risks, both to skilled labor and the environment. However, most would agree that we must keep and nurture a strong labor presence in the DFL. So given this, what do you, as one of the chief authors, as Prove It First, think we can do? Beyond what we see as an environmental problem, to show what the right side of history actually is on this issue and how they and their communities would be well served in the long run to support your bill.
Thanks for that question, Megan. I think what I would say to start off is that I think it's often cast in the way that this question was just asked, that labor is for these projects and labor is pushing these projects without question. But I would push back against that. I think that what we see is a division within labor itself about the wisdom of these particular extractive industry projects, for good reason, because the membership of labor is split on this question. And it's actually, if you look at the numbers from surveys all around Minnesota, including northeastern Minnesota, including on the traditional range area, even, that the majority of people don't support this particular type of mining. They don't support it. They're worried about the effect on our economy. They're worried about the effect on our environment, our public health. And they want this precautionary principle applied to this particular type of mining. So when we're talking about, labor not being on board or labor fighting us on this, I think we need to back up and really think about who we're talking about. I think we're talking about a very, a small slice of organized labor that is rightfully looking out for the economic interests of their membership. And I think those of us who are working in this area and advocating in these areas need to never sort of take any kind of oppositional ground to that motivation, because that motivation of advocating for your membership, advocating for living, thriving, family supporting union wages and benefits for people, for good salaries, good benefits for people to be able to feed their families, have a home, send their kids to school, go on vacation once in a while, have the good quality of life. That is what we need to all be advocating for. And so my own thoughts on this are really grounded in support for organized labor, because I'm a big supporter of organized labor. I grew up in a labor household. I come from a strong union family. I mean, these are part of my core set of beliefs of the importance of organized labor. I believe every worker deserves a union. I believe we should all be unionized. I would like to see organized labor stronger. And so my own sense is that whether we're talking about copper sulfide mining, or we're talking about line 3 and the fossil fuel industry in general being on the wane, and as we look toward this transition to a clean energy economy and creating a sustainable type of development, sustainable industry, sustainable economies, the bedrock of that, the foundation of that, the way that we get there is labor. It's organized labor. It's bringing workers together. It's allying ourselves with organized labor, with workers, to bring that about and to move past what are sort of frivolous billionaires projects, right? I mean, and in many ways, what has happened, I think, is certain segments of organized labor have unfortunately been co-opted by these interests. And just because that has happened doesn't mean we should ever set ourselves up in opposition to organized labor. Like, we are organized labor. And I think, and I hope that part of my election to the Minnesota State Senate is Duluthians in part saying exactly that. We are organized labor. We are rank and file union members. We are also fiercely protective of our water quality, our public health, our economy. And we don't have to choose, and we're not going to be split up and divided any longer on this. So I really do think that much of organized labor is with us. And it really is just a divide that has been sort of cultivated artificially over past years to create this sense of division, when in actuality, if you look at the numbers, if you talk to people, the division is not as large as it seems.
And I'd like to add something to what Jen said is I think she and I are both some of the strongest labor supporters in the legislature. And yet we're perceived, certain folks in the labor and community are trying to portray it as, you guys are anti-labor. And Republicans are trying to say, oh, they're the party of labor now because of this. She's right. A lot of labor movement, I would argue, has been co-opted by these businesses. And it's not like these are friendly businesses to labor. Glencore, the parent company, the one that should be on the permits and everything, isn't. I think about 5 years ago, United Steelworkers, one of their locals down 235A, which is I think in Houston area, they gave a silver medal award to Glencore. Not a good silver medal, but silver medal for what they call them as for corporate irresponsibility, the second worst company in the world for corporate irresponsibility, for the way they treat labor, the way they treat the environment and everything like that. These companies are not, their workers are not their friends. They're always fighting against them. And yet here they come in and convince them, if you folks want a job, if you want a job that can pay you a living wage, this is what you get to do. That's it. Nobody else wants to give you a job with a living wage. And that's where we have to change things. A couple of weeks ago, I think the head of the Laurentian Chamber of Commerce had an article in MinnPost in which he talked about the need to diversify the economy in northeastern Minnesota. His solution? Sulfide mining. Well, we already have ferrous mining. Now we can do sulfide mining, and that's going to diversify things. That's not what we're talking about. We need other approaches to this. And the reason I think some of the labor movement is falling for this is because they don't see any other alternatives, and they haven't done enough to propose it. But I think that's where we have to step up and say, here are ways we can protect the environment and create good union jobs. And that's going to happen. These fights between the attempts to, especially by Republicans, but by certain folks in the business community and others, to create this divide between labor and the environment, it's something we have to fight. 7 years ago, when we were working on the solar bill, I remember hearing from one of the labor leaders who was concerned about, he was supporting the bill, but he said, you know, I got to meet with all the folks who work at the power plants because they're all scared this is going to cost them their jobs. And he says he got hundreds of members who are in that shape. He says he's got hundreds of other members who are doing electrical work for solar projects, and they really know how much we need this. And so it's an issue we cannot dismiss it as a meaningless issue, but we have to recognize that as people who care about the well-being of others, we want working people to have good representation, have decent wages, to have good benefits, have job security. We want all of that, but you don't have to do that by destroying the environment. There are other ways to go about it, and we're being lazy if we say, oh, the only way we can do it is to go ahead and destroy the environment.
Thank you so much, Senator Marty. That's great. And I just have to hand it to what good pros our speakers are, because he just answered 2 other questions that we had coming up in his tag on to Senator McEwen's talk there. So that's wonderful. Thank you so much. And this one just came in, but it just ties into what Senator Marty was saying so well right now. And I'll send this out to any one of our 3 speakers, and because this is something that's near and dear to my heart, and something that I actually, in my personal spare time up in my community, work on too, is my whole family actually is economic development. And up here in northeastern Minnesota. So if mining isn't the answer to our economic viability up here, what type of economic development would be welcomed, and how can the rest of the state support that? I mean, we can go with the 4 T's, however you guys want to take this on. I think Senator McEwen or John Marty, which one do you guys want to go first?
I'll start, but I hope Jen will step in there too. There are a lot of things we ought to be doing. To me, the most obvious first one we ought to be doing across the board is things like high-speed internet and broadband access. That's a no-brainer. I think there's quote bipartisan support for that, but we could do more of that. We could do it faster and get it there, because so many people, I mean, during COVID, you have all these people moving from the Twin Cities up to Lake Country because they want to be in a nice small town environment. And they can do the same work if they have good broadband access. There's so many areas in the field of healthcare. Probably, I mean, one of the biggest industries in any rural communities in the state is related to healthcare. And unfortunately, a lot of those are poor paying jobs and jobs that we shouldn't be treating that way, but there's so many important jobs that should be high paid union jobs. And there's so many other things we can do. I don't want to go through all of it, and I'm not an economic development expert, but there's so much, the low hanging fruit is easy to get at. And the other one, when we get to talking about mining, one of the things that really bugs me, and even a lot of Democrats, I've even heard DFL governors say this many times, and that is, well, you need the mining if we're going to have a clean energy economy, because we need the metals and so on. And we do need metals. When you look at how much metal we are throwing away, you ever watch how they quote recycle e-waste? I mean, so much of it, they're taking a sledgehammer and smashing a computer keyboard, then ripping out little bits and pieces. We should be doing state-of-the-art recycling of e-waste. We are throwing away so much waste. Now we have problems because our landfills are filling up and everything else. Why can't we just go into a high-tech mining of our waste products, mining of our waste stream? We could, I don't care, we could put a big plant on the Iron Range. We could move, we'd have to have railroad cars of e-waste going there and have a good state-of-the-art high-tech metals recovery system, because we in this country throw out a lot more of these metals every year than we could ever possibly mine on the range. And so that's not to say we don't need metals. We do need metals, but when we're looking at economic development, we should be looking at that sort of thing as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on that. I mean, I think that there are so many things that we can do economic development wise, that really we are in a moment right now of transition, with the transition to a clean energy economy, where a lot of things are going to be opening up. So with broadband expansion, and that's fundamental, because broadband is a necessity now. It should be viewed just like plumbing and electricity. I mean, we need it. It should be a public utility, is my own sense. And our transportation infrastructure, there's so many things that we can do to sort of set the stage for a variety of different economic development ideas. And so that is one of the things actually that I really look forward to working on as a state senator, is collaboration with people in northeastern Minnesota about these ideas. I've already had some really great conversations with people about their ideas around sustainable economic development, and what sorts of projects and industry and things that we can encourage in northeastern Minnesota that will be really sustainable and sustain our communities going forward. One idea that I really like a lot is the focusing on our water, that we do in northeastern Minnesota live in this very unique place in the world where we have this fresh water, really like very few other places in the world. And it is possible, I think, that we could become a global center technology-wise, academic-wise, industry-wise, for clean water infrastructure. You know, as we move into these next decades, clean water is going to be a big issue globally for people around the world. And if we, sitting here where we do, become experts, the experts of if we become the epicenter of clean water, we can not only protect our clean water, but we can also develop the technologies, the industry to help other people preserve and protect their water and their water infrastructure. So that's something that I would really like to explore, an idea that I heard expressed. And there's lots of really good work happening already in northeastern Minnesota around this. And I think that we can, working together, we can really elevate the good things that are already happening, and then also come up with some really innovative, forward-looking ideas around economic development.
Thank you so much. And now I've got, do this, hold on. Okay, I've got another question, one that came in before, and then we had one that just came in that I think is going to be a nice follow-up to it as well. I love how everyone around here thinks. So the first one is it's reference to the panel. So please, any of you come up with this, because I think this is not only good for, it's something that would take place in the legislature, but then would really affect how the permitting process and things would end up in court afterwards. So, and I think each of you have a really good different perspective on that. So what is your position on a change in the structure of the state government to place mineral development and responsibility in a department that's responsible for economic development, like DEED, or and to avoid the conflict of interest between natural resource management and mineral exploitation that currently exists in the DNR?
If I could just jump in with
Go ahead, please, Nancy.
And then let the senators talk about how that actually plays out. That has been one of the most frustrating aspects of working closely with the DNR on mining environmental review and permit review. You guys probably aren't aware of this, but going back to January of 2008, Minnesota tribes have been meeting quarterly with the DNR and the MPCA, sometimes leadership, to discuss mining issues and to inform and educate each other about concerns and regulations and frameworks and all of that. And I will say that with PolyMet and with every other EIS that I have reviewed, where the DNR obviously has a role, it is apparent that the DNR will set aside its own really talented hydrologists and scientists and ecologists and biologists, and Lands and Minerals steps forward, and their mission to develop and exploit the state's mineral resources becomes the overriding priority above any of the other missions that the agency has to protect and manage the state's natural resources. That's all I want to say.
I'll add to that, and I appreciate Nancy saying that, because it is a huge conflict of interest. It shouldn't be, in my mind. I actually think it's more appropriate to be in DEED, Department of Economic Development, not into a natural resources department, which is supposed to be protecting those resources. But I wouldn't mind if it stayed where it was, if they would reflect their interest. In other words, the DNR's current mission should be develop the resources we can develop, but do so in a way that protects our environment, protects our state. And they just forget about that. It's kind of, as Nancy said, Lands and Minerals seems to trump everything else. I mean, it's just wrong. And when I've had meetings with DNR over these things, even this past year, I spent about 6 months trying to get a meeting with that one mining engineer consultant that DNR had hired with taxpayer funds. We paid for him, and they won't even let us talk to him because, well, we might get the wrong impressions from him. Um, I've written the DNR saying, you know, and one of the reasons was they're concerned that he might be called to testify when there are lawsuits over the mine permits. And they want to make sure he's not destroyed as a witness for that. And my response to the commissioner was, wait a minute, your job isn't to win a lawsuit. Your job is to protect our environment. Your job is to protect our waters and our lands and our public safety. That's your mission. You're not supposed to be trying to win lawsuits that have a lot of merit to them. And so I don't mind. I mean, I think it would actually be better in deed, but if it stays in DNR, I wouldn't have a problem as long as they reflect their mission. And if part of their mission is to develop minerals, it has to be develop minerals in the broader context of their overall mission to protect the environment. So I could leave it either place, but the main thing is they're just not doing their job properly in terms of protecting the environment.
Yeah, and I do support separating out those roles to deed and between deed and DNR. I think that, you know, just all of the things that Senator Marty was just letting us know about, I agree. It would be great if they were, you know, doing the job that we have charged them to do in that way. But I think, of course, we know that these things do become political. They become politicized, and if there is a conflict of interest in an agency like that, I think that it would serve us well to do the best that we can to kind of eliminate that conflict, so that at least we get, you know, some honest assessments that are geared toward what we want it to be geared to without having that conflict on the side.
Thank you guys so much for that. So the follow-up question that just came in that I think fits in nicely is, well, then how can we strengthen the DNR and the other government agencies' willingness to defend their scientific assumptions and their analyses in court?
I wish I had a great answer to that. The one thing I can say is, speaking to a DFL environmental caucus, we're having fights with DFL administrations on this. We shouldn't, these are fights we shouldn't be having. And it's extremely disappointing. I'm pleased the governor is pushing this clean cars initiative. That's important. Melissa Hortman and I carried the clean car legislation 12, 13 years ago, before we didn't need it because Obama put similar standards, not quite as strict, similar standards into federal law. And then when Trump took them down, we needed the governor to step in and do it, and I'm glad. But things like pipelines, like Line 3, which is basically overwhelming all the good things that are being done in renewable energy and in climate change efforts we're doing at the legislature. You know, we cut back a little bit here and we're going to tighten our standards there. For the Line 3 pipeline, the fuel that's going to flow through it to mine, to extract it, to process it, to transport it, to burn it, will produce more greenhouse gases than the entire rest of the state of Minnesota economy. It's not like Minnesota's going to be consuming that much more. That pipeline's not for Minnesota. It's just transporting it through Minnesota. One decision like that, which has maybe a 50-year limit to it, which will condemn us to fail in our efforts to address climate. That's a DFL administration. I could understand if it was the Pawlenty administration or the Carlson administration, but this is DFL administrations, and we should be not having these fights. So simple answer, I don't know what we can do other than we have to be vocal, and the more environmental caucus is vocal, the more that will help.
Thank you so much. So I got a couple other questions now. I'm going to change gears and go to some more science stuff, get off the politics and move towards science. And so this one came in that was a couple questions that were directed towards Nancy. The first one is, what is our largest source of mercury?
Well, today it's taconite. As part of the strategy work group that put together the statewide mercury TMDL implementation plan back in 2009. At that time, it was the electric power generating industry, far and away. But the electric power generating industry, both because of statewide emission reduction rules and looming federal emissions rules, they saw the writing on the wall and they reduced their emissions early and beyond their sector reduction goals, largely because they shuttered dirty, old coal plants. The financial impetus for building new coal wasn't there. Gas was plentiful, cheap, and much cleaner. And so within the first 5 years after the statewide mercury TMDL implementation plan was in place, the electric power generating sector had already achieved their full sector reduction goals. Since then, each sector does an annual or biennial emissions inventory. And sometimes those emissions inventories are based on actual monitoring data, sometimes just on modeled data. But by and large, the other places where we have mercury emissions that we know about coming from purposeful use and products, things like compact fluorescent lights and meters that used to have mercury, those have all been dealt with. And we're ratcheting down the emissions associated with that purposeful use. And it was just a couple of weeks ago that we had our statewide mercury TMDL stakeholder check-in. And it was clear that standing here in 2021 and projecting out to 2025, when the statewide mercury reduction goal under the statewide TMDL is intended to be met, we're not going to meet it. And the only reason we're not going to meet it is because at this point, the taconite industry has thrown up their hands and said that, oops, we can't afford to reduce our mercury emissions. Not that it isn't possible, not that there isn't technology, we can't afford it. It'll put us out of business. Maybe somebody else can reduce somewhere else and we'll still need it. They are not good corporate citizens. I see this not only with mercury, but sulfate and water quality, et cetera, et cetera. The taconite industry in Minnesota is the biggest source of mercury in the state of Minnesota, in the Lake Superior Basin, and in a group of about 8 or 9 upper Midwest states, bar none.
Thank you. And then I guess I have 2 follow-up questions to this. And the first one would be, and I'm going to go with the taconite one, and then we'll come back to mercury, is how do we have a mine in Minnesota that's operating without a permit?
Well, if you're talking about the existing taconite mines, they have permits. They may have expired 25, 30 years ago, but if they meet the administrative requirements of submitting an application within the required time frame, then administratively the MPCA can continue that permit without reissuing a new one. And that is what has been going on for decades. And at the point where the tribes began to engage, pointing out the problems with the sulfate standard and wild rice waters, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not the only one. That's not the only water quality standard that they're not meeting. That's when we became aware of what I call, and others call, regulatory capture by industry. Industry is telling MPCA which rules and limits they will abide by and which ones they won't. And you see that playing out in a newly issued Mintac NIPDES permit that we sued and challenged in court. In the permit that was issued for PolyMed, when our MPCA commissioner went to the regional administrator at EPA and said, please don't send us written comments. And because we know that this NPDES permit that we're getting ready to issue for Polymet is deficient. So don't send us comments. You just see that over and over again. It's called permit as a shield. They have a permit that is legit on paper and meets the administrative requirements. It does not meet the intended goal of protecting the resources and limiting the pollution. And that is the MO for all of the permitting that I'm seeing.
Then I have another follow-up mercury question for you. And we were wondering if you could explain to us a little bit about methyl mercury and sulfide and how that makes mercury bioabsorbed.
So, excuse me, mercury is in the atmosphere. It's emitted in various forms, but the form of mercury that can actually get into a living being, a plant or an animal, is methyl mercury. And the way that elemental or ionic mercury is transformed to methyl mercury is by microbes. And specifically, one of the biggest groups and most successful groups of microbes are those that reduce sulfur or reduce sulfate. And a byproduct is methyl mercury. And when you have waters in Minnesota that are naturally really, really low in sulfate, like single digits. That's the natural concentration of sulfate in our waters. When you add sulfate to those waters, the mercury that it encounters in the sediments that runs off from the watershed can all be reduced in that environment where there's low oxygen, and the outcome is methyl mercury. And then that's taken up by plants and algae, and then it's taken up by the next layers of the food web, the benthic invertebrates, the zooplankton, and then the little prey fish, and then the predator fish. And so it works its way up the food web in the methyl mercury form, and it magnifies at each level. So that by the time you get to a trophy walleye, that mercury that first entered the food web in algae or a mayfly larva has been magnified to the extent that me eating that fish, or your child eating that fish, or a loon eating that fish are at risk for the neurological, cardio, reproductive effects of mercury. So sulfate is like a catalyst in the environment that takes the mercury that's all around and converts it to methyl mercury.
And if I can add one thing to that, and when you saw that study a few years ago, I think it was northeastern Minnesota, the high number of newborns that had dangerous levels of mercury in them, that's because of the sulfate. It's because of exactly the process you said. That's how it's getting in the food chain for people, and in effect, it's an outcome of this pollution that people are suffering. And much of the mercury that is in the water in the first place came from power plants and other things. So it was not there naturally. So we're slowly poisoning our own population with this.
Thank you, everyone. That was really interesting. So I have a couple more questions in here about mines, but I wanted to first preface it with a couple comments that came in from our viewers today, and that recycling for rare metals actually takes significantly less energy than mining for them, and that only 10% of our copper is recycled in this world. I mean, I know I've worked, they're copper pirates of sort. They were all just looking for copper scrap, but versus mining it, because it's cheaper to do that and more efficient to do that than open a new mine. So having said all of that, you know, is there really any requirement for this? Is it necessary? Does it fall under any kind of statute or federal mandate that would require this kind of mining for something such as strategic mining?
You know, if I understand the question, correctly, it's it is the question, do we need to do this do we need to do this type of mining in northeastern Minnesota for these metals?
Yes, and like, do we need them for any kind of strategic mining? Are they really necessary for renewables? Everybody has that argument where, well, everyone has a cell phone, you want wind turbines. Would this kind of mining fall under any kind of strategic mining statute or mandate?
I'll just quick speak to that. As far as I know, and I have researched this because this is one of the issues that, as you said, Megan, proponents of this type of mining will often throw this out, along with child labor in the Congo. That's another one that I've heard. As a sort of, well, we have to do it here. We have to do this type of mining here because we need these metals. We need these, we need the copper, we need the nickel, et cetera, in order, to have these, and in order to fuel the clean energy economy that we know that we're transitioning into right now. But actually the numbers, when you look at it, don't bear that out. As the commenter said, copper in particular can be recycled again and again, and we're not recycling nearly the amount of copper that we already have available, that has already been mined, that's already out in the environment. So recycling copper is something that we really should be looking into, absolutely. And as far as all of the other metals, I do think that it's worth taking an honest look at all of them and seeing kind of where we're at in terms of our needs. But really, that's just, the argument is a real red herring argument, that we don't need to tear up northeastern Minnesota to get these metals. If in fact, we don't have enough of them, or we can't recycle other certain metals, we can insist on it being done well and fairly in places where it is better an idea environmentally to do that. So I think that we do need to have a discussion about the kinds of inputs that we need for the clean energy economy and where those are best obtained. But if people are trying to make us choose between, and they are, in reality, that it is what they're trying to do, is force us into this choice where we have to either choose our clean water in our economies in northeastern Minnesota, or we have to choose the clean energy economy. We have to be against child labor, but that's a false choice. We do not have to choose between those things. We can preserve and protect our clean water in northeastern Minnesota. We can get what we need in order to fuel the clean energy economy. And also just, copper in particular, the efficiencies that we've seen in technology just, in the last 20 years or so, the numbers bear out that we don't need as much copper as we did with the technology of years ago. So things are much more efficient now than they used to be. And I think when people bring that argument to us, we have to say, well, let's take an honest look at that. Let's actually look at it. But I don't think that the numbers bear out. And it's certainly not acceptable that we would tear up northeastern Minnesota to get those metals.
I'd like to piggyback on Jen's comments with two things. One of which is that we do need metals for the economy. We absolutely do. But we are not even trying to be efficient with our use of things. Somebody once said that, what do you do with your garbage? You throw it away. And they say, well, the earth is a closed system. There is no away. When we throw our garbage away, it's like, yeah, it's in our own backyard. We're throwing it, if the planet as a whole. And we need those metals. We need those resources that we're just burning up, that we're just burning through. And there will be a time in the future when they're going to be mining our landfills. They're going to have to. And in a closed environment like we have, with a finite amount of resources, we ought to be doing that now. And it's shameful that we're not. But the other point I wanted to make real quickly is, whenever you hear somebody say, well, and I've heard DFL governors say this one too, you know, we need these meadows because, you know, you need them for wind turbines, you need them for cell phones, you need them. They always talk about how the clean energy economy needs these meadows. The old economy, oh, it didn't need them at all. Of course it did. They're just using it. They're just trying to say, well, you guys are hypocritical because you don't want to be mining these meadows. No, we want to have the meadows we need for our economy, but let's do it in the cleanest way possible. And let's not use them because it's cheap. You know, at some point, I wouldn't doubt if some technology at some point would make it feasible to mine in northeastern Minnesota somehow in a safe, clean environment. I'll guarantee it would cost a lot more. It's not economically viable. It's not economical because we can get this stuff for so cheap this way and everybody else wants it cheap and everything. Well, the cheapest way to get it right now, even I would guess in most cases, is recycling. But we're not putting any effort into that because there's no industry involved around that. So we have to recognize that the economy is set up in a way that they got to get it cheap. If they were to put in strong, I mean, even like the tailings dam I was talking about earlier. Oh, there are other ways they could do dry stacking. They could do other stuff. If they were serious about best practices, they'd have to do that. But we're not interested in doing it the right way because it costs more. And we're not interested in doing it the cheaper way because, well, we don't want to recycle. We want to mine more stuff because it's easier for a company to make profits off of that. But we have to change the way we do this because we're a finite planet with a lot of people on it, and we can't just keep throwing things away as if we can always dig new stuff out of the earth.
Thank you. So we got a couple great follow-up questions to as you guys were talking about this, as well as one that came in earlier. And one of them's kind of a comment question that'll lead me into another question that came through. And the one is, you know, they're telling us that, like you said, we need these metals so badly, but then we're also hearing that PolyMet's going to be selling to China for their first 5 years. So what percentage of the total value of this mined copper from PolyMet is going to remain in Minnesota or even in the US for that matter? I think all three of you are probably experts in this question.
It's going to go to the highest bidder. There's no guarantee that any of us living in Minnesota are going to see a gram of the copper that's produced from PolyMet. In fact, there's plenty of reason to believe that we won't. And that the same is true of what little I've seen about the proposed Twin Metals mine. We're not even going to refine it here. We're going to concentrate it, and then the value added takes place somewhere else, and then the final product takes place somewhere else.
And there's a lot of speculation as well that if PolyMet were built, it may not go into operation right away. They want the permits so they can go. That's what the value is to them. But the worldwide copper situation, some of the economists say that it's not likely to be done now. It's likely when they say we need these jobs on the Iron Range. So they're not likely to happen soon. I think there's some significant economic speculation that they want the permits, they get them, and once they have them, they can hold them. But because there is a glut of copper worldwide right now.
Yeah, and I would just add, this is global capitalism, right? I mean, they're coming after a resource that we have that is, not ideal in the form that it's in here in northeastern Minnesota. But the idea is just to take it and then to sell it on the market. And we've seen this over and over again. This is a pattern that we have seen with global capitalism of these extractive industries. This is what they do. They go into a community, they take the resource, and then it's shipped out, it's refined elsewhere, the value is added elsewhere. And it's all about, this whole thing is about making money for a very small number of individuals, of wealthy individuals. And again, this isn't like a project that we would decide to do as a community for ourselves because it doesn't make sense economically. The only reason it makes sense for them to pursue this is if they can load off the costs onto us and leave us holding the bag. So that's the only way that a project like this makes sense, is if you can use, you know, a community and offload the costs on the environment and on the community and on the workers, and then just take the extracted wealth and say, see you later.
Thank you, guys. So I'm going to veer into, I want to kind of veer back into prove it first. And another question came in that I think is going to be a great segue for that right now. And that's that these proposed mines seem likely not to really produce a lot of copper. And so is there any kind of longer term, larger plans to tear up a much larger region in northern Minnesota to make this a worthwhile venture for the companies? And are these the two proposals that we currently have out there right now a first step in the plan to be open about at this stage? I'm sorry, that second part of the question is kind of interesting, but.
I'll start real quickly. One of the MCEA and other lawsuits against the mine is that PolyMet misled the regulators. They were telling their investors about basically quadrupling the size of the project. And they said, well, we don't have plans yet. But they're trying to sell this to their investors, but they weren't sharing it with the DNR. And there is a requirement in our permit laws that Nancy probably knows better than me, but there is a requirement in there that has to be an honest application. You can't be covering up what your real plans are. And they are planning, they've at least told investors, PolyMet has asked investors to invest in a much bigger project there. So I think there's been some dishonesty there. I don't know, but I'm guessing from what I hear that they're likely to try and expand.
Well, one comment that I would have too is, you know, we hear rumors not just of the whole PolyMet bait and switch thing that we had lawsuits on, but of really getting deep into the Duluth complex. What are you guys' thoughts and opinions about that?
Yeah, that was also what I was going to bring up too, Megan, is that, you know, my understanding is that this is potentially the tip of the iceberg, that if PolyMet is approved, a number of companies are already lined up with mineral rights to, you know, the entire Duluth complex, which runs from way up north all the way to just north of Duluth, pretty close to my house, actually. And so if PolyMet is developed and that begins, then they will have sort of forged the way for all of these companies lined up behind them to do the same. It really could, and I don't think it's overstating it in other forums that we've had with other experts. This really is a struggle for northeastern Minnesota. You know, I mean, it really is. It could mean the end of northeastern Minnesota as we know it if these mines are allowed to go forward. So when we go up there and we see those wetlands and we see that water in that beautiful North Woods, this could really mean the end of that. And if you've traveled, you know, I've traveled many places in our country and I've seen many places where you look out on this industrialized landscape and you try to imagine what that place looked like before. You know, whether it's the mountaintop removals in West Virginia and in the Appalachians, or, you know, these huge mega monster mines down in the Southwest that we've seen in Arizona, where the landscape has just turned into a moonscape. That is actually what we're facing. That's what we're facing in northeastern Minnesota. And I don't think, and it's an exaggeration to really lay that all out for us to consider, that if we open this door, we have a whole, you know, lineup of millionaires and billionaires ready to just board that train and do the same thing.
I would have to jump in and say, for the bands, it is existential, without a doubt. You know, PolyMet did make it through environmental review, and PolyMet did get all their permits, but they're not operating yet because there's a lot of pushback from a lot of directions And to the extent that the litigation will require a more honest inspection and evaluation and daylight being shown on the regulatory malpractice that led us to this place, then if we can keep Polymet from being able to operate, that sends a pretty profound message. Twin Metals is, I think, looked really closely at the experience that Polymet had in the really protracted environmental review, and took a few pages from that. And obviously you're coming back with a scale down project and a proposal to do dry stack tailings and backfilling a lot of their mine waste into their underground mine. All of those things were big hangups in the Polymet environmental review. Right now, the challenge for those of us who are examining the project proposal here during the scoping part of the EIS phase are trying to figure out, okay, where are they gaming the system this time? Because again, there is no place on the planet that I'm aware of where sulfide ore has been mined in a wet environment that did not lead to uncontrollable water pollution. So it's important that we are continuing to fight the operation of Polymet, even though they have permits in hand, because I do believe that if they do get to blast a hole in the ground, the 1854 ceded territory, the St. Louis River watershed, the Boundary Waters watershed eventually will all be irreparably and permanently impacted.
I like it that Nancy said regulatory malpractice. I think that's a good way to describe it. I mean, we've, as you said, Twin Meadows is learning from the experience. They find out if Polymet can get through the cracks and get through here and weave their way through the administrative process by undersizing what their actual plans are and doing all these other things. Hey, we can do it too. And Nancy, I think you earlier mentioned what happened a couple of years ago when the PCA asked the Environmental Protection Agency not to submit their written comments, which they already had. Don't submit them and write them. Just read them to us, speed read them to us over the phone. I mean, that's nuts. That's absolutely corrupt. And that was done by our state agencies, and it's in court still. But if we let this get away here, everybody else is going to figure, who cares? Even if our laws were strong, and they're not that strong, but even if our laws were that strong, everybody's going to enforce them. So that's why it's so essential. Yeah, I keep thinking some environmental groups and some politicians were saying, well, we'll let Polymet go through, but we'll protect the boundary waters. No, this is all in the same. If we let Polymet go through, they're going to walk all over us again. So I think the regulatory malpractice, or however you described it, was a good way to summarize what's happened.
I love that regulatory malpractice. That's exactly the perfect word to use after what we went through this past, what is it, about a year and a half ago it all came out that this was what went down? Yeah. So I have a couple of questions on watersheds. And one that just came in was what watersheds are going to be impacted by this threat of mining in the Duluth complex? Because we know right now we have the St. Louis River watershed, and then we have the Rainy River watershed that could be impacted by Twin Metals. And would this potentially impact something like the Mississippi River?
So sulfide mining as a whole, yeah, actually the exploration that's going on out in Tamarack. Right now, I think Talon Metals is the operating entity, but before that it was Kennecott Rio Tinto. They've been doing significant exploration out in the area very near the sandy flowage. So I've got a map that I like to use when I do public speaking about mining. And if you imagine the Arrowhead region of Minnesota and you look at that lightning bolt shape of the Iron Range that stretches across it, the Duluth complex intrusion runs up along the eastern edge of that. So a lot of the copper nickel projects, polymet, twin metals, the ones that are furthest along, are in that Duluth complex area that is up in this region. What you also notice is that right at HIBTech, we have a major North American continental divide. It's called the Hill of Three Waters. There is a point where the Rainy River, which drains to the Hudson, the St. Louis River, which drains to Lake Superior, and the Upper Mississippi all come together. And so, yes, the Mesabi Iron Range straddles those three major watersheds, and the copper nickel interest and exploration is active in all three watersheds, but furthest along in the St. Louis and Rainy. And I would also point out that the tribe's evaluation in the environmental review and permitting process of the Polymet project showed the DNR's and Polymet's predictions of water quality impacts that would happen at closure to be entirely wrong. They assumed that all of that polluted pit water from the empty pit at Polymet at closure was going to move south into the Partridge and St. Louis rivers. And what we were able to demonstrate is that by the time Polymet, if they were to operate a 20-year mine project as they were permitted for, by the time they finished, the North Shore Peter Mitchell pit would also have been mined out. And the hydrologic head that governs the direction the groundwater moves would, by necessity, by the laws of physics, draw the polluted pit water from Polymet northward into the Rainy River watershed. And the state and federal agencies went ahead and permitted the project and slapped a Band-Aid called adaptive management onto the permits to say, well, maybe this is true, but if it really happens, we'll deal with it then. So some more malpractice.
Okay, great, thank you. I want to ask one last question before we lose Senator Marty. And it's kind of an intricacy on prove it first. And then I want to follow it up with knowing all this, everything we've heard from our speakers, which has just been fascinating. How do we help you get this passed? And so the one that we want to talk, I really have been curious about this whole time has been, the proposal of Prove It First is having tested in a similar environment. Well, how are we going to define similar, and who or what do you think should make that determination as to what similar is?
I'll make a quick comment on it. I don't know that we, that's the trouble with our current system. I mean, I'll repeat Nancy's comment, regulatory malpractice. They've done everything wrong they could. We say in a similar environment, well, though, bottom line is I think Jenn's bill requires them to show that they did it anywhere. And they haven't. I mean, that's the trouble. They've never done one of these mines that has not caused real environmental damage. And so those are details, and they're important details, but at this point, the politics is such that we're huge uphill battle to get there. But I think the wording would work in the bill as is if it came up and if we passed it. I'd be thrilled to have that because we'll win that one in court. I just think if we can get her bill passed, we'll be in great shape. I know, and she knows, and I think we all know this year it's not going to happen. And our main thing is I'm doing everything I can to help MCEA and the other environmental groups that are going to court and fighting this. And all of you lawyers who are doing that, Megan, I appreciate that. We need that. We shouldn't be in court on this. We should have won this in the regulatory process, but it was the malfeasance. and improper work. So I'll be comfortable if we can get this bill passed. I think it'll be a good start, but I'm hoping we can stop this in the process before it gets through the courts now. And again, the proponents of the mines keep saying how it's been such a long process. Yeah, but a long, weak process, a long, flawed process. And I don't care how fast it happens. It should happen in a good regulatory process, not one where people cheat every step of the way and do things improperly. But no, I don't know. They could twist anything we pass that way, but that's why we have to make sure that our administrations are representing the public interest and doing their job. And if it takes lawyers to go to court, so be it. But we should be making sure elected officials do better than that. And since I have to leave, I have something at 3:15. I didn't know how long this went. I just want to say thanks to the Environmental Caucus and all of you. This is fun. And thank you, Duluth people, for sending Jenn down to the legislature, because it really helps to have such strong leadership. So hope you have a good weekend. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Senator Marty. Really appreciate that. So I want to turn our attention for as long as he wants to give it to us, is the Executive Director of Friends of the Boundary Waters, Chris Knopf, has joined us today and has sat with us during this whole thing. And I gotta say, Friends of the Boundary Waters, especially the past couple of years, have just been at a real forefront with Prove It First. And I don't know which lawsuits that you aren't a plaintiff in, as much as I try to keep track. So I just wanted to give Chris a few moments of his time to talk to us today, if he'd be willing.
Why, thank you, Megan. And I want to thank, I have a lot of energy behind me now. I have a dog and my 3.5-year-old grandson now. But I want to thank Nancy Schuldt and the great victory they had this past week in federal court. So thank you so much for the work at the Fond du Lac Band here. And thanks Senator McEwen and Senator Marty that just left us here. I want to leave with sort of two big things here. First, that this is really a grassroots effort, and that this is where the leadership is provided by from all of you that are part of the DFL Environmental Caucus and ordinary people that are concerned about the environment and our future. And so I want to thank everyone that's on this call right now, because you're providing that leadership. And it started in the caucuses with the resolution, and so that was an essential part of this larger movement. The second thing is that, environmental law can be very, very complicated, and sometimes we get caught up in the complexity. And the power of Prove It First is its simplicity and common sense. That often a young child asks that very simple question that's so profound. And so that's what we're asking here with Prove It First, is to prove it first, that if in fact that it is safe for the environment, prove it first. And that's what's so powerful about it, is that it cuts through the sort of the complexities of regulatory capture that has been discussed this afternoon. Prove It First cuts through that. And so that's why it is so powerful. I do want to say that we're at a really critical stage here, and for the DFL Environmental Caucus here, we are trying to get a hearing before the House Environment and Natural Resources Committee here, and we need your help there. If you would please communicate to Chairman Rick Hansen that to have a hearing on this bill here, and this is something that we the citizens really deserve to have a hearing on this bill. When you have over 45 members of the legislature between the Senate and the House co-sponsoring a bill, there's real grassroots power behind that. So if you could please communicate to Representative Rick Hansen on that. I know that he has a town hall meeting tomorrow. And so for those of you that are able to be part of that, to communicate with them on that. And then there was a recent, just the other day, Senate District 46 had a town hall hearing there. And for those of you that can communicate to Representative Ryan Winkler, who is an opponent of this bill, and to Senator Ron Latz, who is also an opponent of this bill, to tell them to really look at this bill, that this bill would stop Polymet, because Polymet's permits are not active now, and communicate that to them. So please, this is the DFL Environmental Caucus, and the power and the progress that you have made these last few years to make this a priority are so important. So those would be two very specific action steps there that we need right now there. I guess kind of a final thought looking forward here, that this is a collective movement, a we sort of activity. And so for everyone that's on this phone here, if you were to talk with one other person, whether it's a social justice organization or a faith-based organization, or our friends in labor as well. We want to expand beyond our circle right now. We know that that's the power of protecting our natural resources, is this collective effort here. So thanks to all of you for the work that you're doing. We're very grateful, and Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness, we're very grateful for all the elected officials and all of you that are making this a priority.
Thank you so much, Chris. It was really wonderful. And on top of that, not just Rick Hansen's got a town hall tomorrow, but for all of you, go to your state representative and ask for this hearing on this bill. Ask your state senator to sign on to one of the bill clones if your state senator hasn't already signed on to this. We have a Google form out there, and you can just, that I think was sent out in emails earlier today, or in previous ones, that can be used for this. But Chris did a great job right now of just asking to get this set for a hearing, but I want to turn to Jen real quick. Is there anything in the Senate that we could do to help this bill move forward?
Yeah, I think the most important thing in the Senate right now is what Chris was talking about a little bit there, is contact your senator and express your support for this Prove It First legislation. Tell them you want them to support it. If you can find out whether they might already be supporting it, hopefully they are one of the co-authors. But don't worry about the clone thing. You just call it Prove It First. Let them know that you support them proving it, or you support them getting behind Prove It First. You like them to co-author it. And I think that, those communications do really make a difference. This is just my first month and a half being an elected official, but I can tell you that it does make an impression. Those emails that come into your inbox, if you get a whole flood of them about a certain topic, and a bunch of your constituents are saying, hi, it's me, and I know about this, and I'd really like you to support that. It really does make a difference. And if your senator already does support it, it will help sort of shore up their decision of, yes, I am doing the right thing by supporting this bill. This is the direction my constituency is going. This is where they want me to be. And if they haven't signed on yet, I can tell you that I think there are a number of senators who are sort of on the fence because of the pressures that we've talked about today in our discussion, sometimes with that segment of organized labor, sometimes within the power dynamics within our own DFL party. There are a certain number of senators who are kind of on the fence. And I think even perhaps some Republican senators, there may be a handful of them who are ready, or who are almost there. So if they can just get that push and that reassurance that you're behind them, if they make that decision, if they take that leap and support Prove It First, that could really help move things forward.
So could I just jump in quickly and say, Senator McEwen, I strongly support this bill, and you are my senator, so you've heard from me.
Oh, that was sweet. Well, and Kristen, if you're looking over in the chat, has been putting up some links both to our website, to our Prove It First on our DFL Environmental Caucus website, which is just dflenvironment.org, as well as a couple Google Docs, one of which is this Prove It First facts, which we've kind of talked about, and as far as action steps to do when you talk to your state legislature. And the other one that's up there that is really great is a little bit about citizen lobbying. And it's how to organize a lobby meeting or phone conversation with your legislator. So if you want to click on one of those, it's a fantastic one. And just to go through real quick, always plan on your meeting being a little shorter than it is. Make sure you introduce yourself, your affiliation, credentials, where you're from. Be thankful up front. Go ahead and tell a story. Tell your story when you're doing this ask. Make it personal. Lead with the heart and talk about why this issue is important to you. Look for a shared value with your legislator and make sure you have the key facts that go into this. Now, like here it is, Kristen's putting it all up in there. So I just wanted to hit some bullet points on that. And a couple other things you can do is the Minnesota State Supreme Court, as well as several federal courts right now, are going to be issuing rulings on whether the state must review additional environmental issues, on whether PolyMet engaged in sham permitting under the reporting and amount of material it tends to mine. There's some twin metals lawsuits out there in federal court right now too. So keep an eye on those because they're so informative to keep you apprised of what's going on right now. And I'm so glad Chris could join us because that's another thing. We would really like you to support the work of Friends of the Boundary Waters and a lot of the other groups that are doing this. One of our board members, I don't think she's able to be here today, Holly Jenkins, she's also on the board of Friends of the Boundary Waters. So it's really nice that our organizations can be partners on this. And so with that, we are just a few minutes away from 3:30, and I'd like to turn this back to our chair, Vida, for anything she'd like to say wrapping up.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? All right. Thanks so much, everybody, for this great presentation. Many great facts shared, a lot of great discussion. And now we are looking, like Megan said, to you all to act, to help us make sure that your senators and representatives and Rick Hansen and Ryan Winkler know that we want this bill heard and supported. And so I'm just projecting right now, this is on our website. Kristen had put the link in, all the forms that we're speaking about, an action fact sheet, the lobby meeting planning form, as well as a Google form for you to fill out after your visit or phone call are there. And it's all found through our website at dflenvironment.org. The other thing is, I would just like to remind you that, again, on March 4th, we have another forum coming up that you're not going to want to miss, Clean Car Rule with Bill McEwen. So please, Jana, plan on joining us. All the information is on our Facebook page and website at that same website we just sent you to. And I want to also remind you that we need your voice. Please join the caucus. It's easy to sign up, and that will get you action alerts from our amazing Greg Layden, our legislative director. Wave hi, Greg, and other awesome actions that you can take. We are part of a community, and we are stronger together. So with that, I want to thank you all and all our organizers. Thank you to Megan, amazing moderator. Thank you, audience, for all your great questions, and to the senators and to Nancy. Appreciate you all very much. All right, so let's start making some calls. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.